Welcome back. This next panel is about a country that is really at the center of everything we're talking about, other than, of course, Georgia.
Nice to meeting you.
And that is Ukraine, where Russia's brutal, unprovoked, and unjustified invasion of Ukraine has created the worst security crisis on the European continent since World War II. And it is incumbent upon all of us to do everything we can to help Ukraine to victory and to Russian defeat. And here we have a terrific panel to discuss all of this. And I'll just quickly introduce Bill Taylor with the U.S. Institute of Peace and former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Oleh Shamshur, with the Atlantic Council and former Ukrainian ambassador to the United States.
And France. And France.
And France, I'm sorry, and France. Belgium too, I think, right? Oh, sort of. It's a small country.
Careful there.
Sevgil Musaieva, who is with Ukrainska Pravda. We're delighted to have you here, and thank you for making the trip. James Nixey with Chatham House, and an expert on this region. And last but not least, Diana Janse with the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, involved in development, and a former ambassador here in Georgia. And Diana, we're really thrilled to have you back here with us as well.
Thank you.
So what I'd like to do to kick us off, Sevgil, if we can, to start with you, you're just from Ukraine. Give us a sense of the mood, what people are thinking, particularly in light of the Kursk move by Ukrainian forces, but also the relentless bombardment by Russian forces.
Yes, thank you, David. I have a story from the last night. So last night I decided maybe just to be fresh to this panel, I had to go to the bed until 12 a.m. And then it was an opposite nightclub. It was really loud. I was listening techno music for 1 hour, and then I called to the reception and said, so what is here? So we are not ready for that in Ukraine. They told me the club is working till 2 a.m. So, okay, give me please earplugs. They gave me earplugs, and then, but for some reason I woke up at 5 a.m. Why? Because I forgot to turn off my notification about air alert in Ukraine, and it was another terrible attack. Unfortunately, thousands of missiles attacked again Ukraine, attacked Kharkiv, attacked Kiev. Among them were ballistic missiles. Today, thanks God, without casualties in Ukraine capital. We have only 2 people have been wounded, some buildings were damaged, but still. So this is the beginning of actually school year for a lot of Ukrainian kids. And after this sleepless night, they went to school with like smiles and everything. So answering your question, how are Ukrainians during this terrible time? We can achieve, I think, everything. We can adapt to all situations we already faced with electricity outages, with everything. We're still trying to be optimistic about things and to keep our sense of humor. That's why the most popular joke today was that we have a very special nightlife in Kiev. So, but still, we have a lot of things to achieve. We are very thankful to our partners for your support, for your solidarity with Ukraine. But there are a lot of things to do with us, with you. First of all, the permission to hit Russian airfields. This is critical. This is the most important things to do right now. Because, you know, Ukrainian cities are suffering because of missile attacks. For example, on my way to Georgia, Kharkiv was under attack. 7 people were kids. Among them was a girl I met during my trip to Kharkiv. She is 18 years old artist, Nika Kozushka, and she was killed by a Russian missile. And of course, this is about our future and about that will never actually happen, because this talented girl was killed by Russian missiles. So what we need now, this is the most important, just to protect our civilians. Please give us permission to hit Russian airfields. We will do everything. So the other things, you know, that situation on Pokrovsk region, this big city in Donetsk region, region. And yesterday, as a journalist, I helped to another one journalist who is 14 years old boy, and he interviewed me and other famous people in Ukraine, and he's from Prokhorovsk. And now, yesterday, he was evacuated with his family in Kryvyi Rih, another city not on the front line, like a little bit silent, but still with missile attacks, with everything. And with all Facebook community, we were looking for his apartment for family to stay. Because Russians are 10 kilometers from Pokrovsk, and Pokrovsk will be the main target for Russian forces for the next months. And they definitely, for all forecasts that we have, maybe Russians will attack and will be close to Pokrovsk in the middle of September. But still, you asked me about Kursk. I think that was a very important point, the beginning of August, and why it's important operation from three perspectives. First of all, it was a huge moral boost for Ukrainians, because you know, when you live at war at full-scale invasion, 2.5 years old, you see casualties, you're everything faced with the grief. Okay, we invaded Russia, are you kidding us? So it was important moral boost for the nation that we can keep forward, we have to move forward, we have to do something with that, and we will do. The second, of course, there are a lot of rumors about negotiations, we are still here, and of course, last 2 months before Kursk operation, it was a #1 question. So will it force Ukraine to negotiate with Russia? Now we have an answer to these questions. Ukraine still have an opportunity to fight and have a moral boost to fight, even in this terrible circumstance and situation. So, and actually, the most important, we brought the war on Russia. And it was also very important just that Russia affected by war, Russian people affected by war. Russian propaganda did everything possible that people will be not affected by war, among them who are not fighting. Now war came to this house, you know, that Suja and all these cities under attack, and actually, so I think it was like 3 important points for us to start this operation. Let us see what will happen next, but yeah.
Sevgil, thank you. Sevgil touched on this briefly. What does Ukraine need in order to achieve victory?
Well, actually, before I try to answer this very basic, but I would say the most important question, I would like to corroborate what was said by Sevgil. From my personal experience, during this war, you are getting accustomed to the things you shouldn't get accustomed to. And at the same time, I would like to stress that we will never give up, because we understand it's not about the existence of our state, it's also about the physical existence, physical integrity of the most of Ukrainians. So for us, there is no third option. So either we win or not, but we will win. Well, what do we need for winning? Actually, I think that to some extent, also listening to the previous terrific panel, I felt a bit frustrated as in the war in the 3rd year, and we are still grappling, discussing the same questions. And unfortunately, many people in the West, they either still they do not understand, or they pretend not to understand. And maybe the worst, that the Western politicians, even if they understand, still are not ready to follow the mental understanding with the acts. So what do we need? We need basic things. So we need military and economic assistance. We need tightening of the sanctions regime. Those are the basic things. So you named this conference as the pivotal year. That's true. But I would say that we are facing the pivot in continuum since 2022. And still, I think you're right, this year can be a game changer, it can be a breaking point. In a sense that, first we should look at the situation quite openly. So still, the strategic military initiative is with Russia. Still they are threatening the Donbass. Still they are bombing and intimidating Ukrainians practically each day, and still the war machine of Russia is functioning. But I think that we should and we can change the equation, change the dynamics, and the Kherson or Kursk offensive shows that this is possible. What do we need in looking at this triad of things? So firstly, about the military assistance. Definitely more in amount, nomenclature, meaning that it should include the long-range missile systems and also timing. Secondly, the limitations, restrictions on the use of the missile systems of the Western military equipment should be lifted immediately. Because if you look at this restriction, firstly, it's absurd. It's meaning that people who are imposing those restrictions still do not understand that we are dealing with a full-scale war. And from the point of view of the military expediency, military logic, definitely those restrictions, they make absolutely no sense. Speaking about sanctions, I think that one point is actually to make those sanctions really comprehensive. That's important, but not less important is the issue of eliminating all the loopholes that do exist in the sanctions regime. And at the same time, it should be recognized that those who would like to help Russia developed a very sophisticated regime of circumventing sanctions, and that should be dealt with immediately. All those things that should be done, which are not being done, then we go back to one basic, again, issue. And I mentioned that last year. That's the absence, still, the absence of the strategic clarity on the part of our partners. And this strategic clarity should mean that any end of the war on the terms acceptable and good for Ukraine and for our partners, it goes through the deep military defeat of Russia. There is no possibility for interim solution. And I think that if all those things will be coming together, it's possible to change the dynamics and end the war with Ukrainian victory and Russian defeat.
Well, that's a perfect segue to Bill about strategic clarity. Has the United States provided enough strategic clarity? Have our European allies provided enough strategic clarity? And are we doing enough in broad terms to help Ukraine win?
On the last question, we're not doing enough. We clearly can do more and should do more and will do more, I'm convinced. I'll leave it to James and Diane to talk about whether the Europeans, but the Americans could certainly do more. On your first part of your question, David, strategic clarity, and Oleg's mentioned this, Ivanka mentioned this on the table last night, Daria asked the same question, and I am confident that the United States policy, which has not been clear up until very recent, up until last week, has not been clear, has begun to come into focus. And I say that last week, President Biden put a statement out in his own name, not at any major issue, but he looked for a place, he looked for some event to make a statement on this point, David. And it was this enormous attack of a week ago on Ukraine by the Russians. And he put out a statement that was mainly saying how horrible that was and how much we opposed it and were disgusted by it. But the last sentence of that statement was an opportunity for him, for President Biden, to say what the U.S. policy is. We know what President Biden has said over and over and over is, we'll stand with the people of Ukraine for as long as it takes. Well, that's not what he said last week. There's a change, which I think is a change in purpose, in clarity of purpose. And what he said was, the United States will stand with the people of Ukraine until they prevail, until they win. That's a big deal. In particular, as you have pointed out, David, we've had this conversation, and if that is followed by concrete steps along the lines that you just mentioned, in the first instance, the removal of this restriction on how deeply the Ukrainians can use ATACMS into Russia. That's the first one, and the others as well will follow. But once it's clear that our policy is for Ukraine to win, to prevail, then these other decisions follow. Ivanka mentioned the concern about escalation. And even there, the head CIA director, Bill Burns, has made it very clear that in the past several months, he has said in writing, in public, that this fear of escalation was way overstated, was overblown. And he went on to say that fear, while it's not irrational, you can't dismiss it totally, but it should not keep us from doing what we need to do, what we should do. And so those two things, David, I think indicate that the concern about escalation is down, not zero, and the strategic clarity, Ukraine winning, has been stated.
So James, Bill said he's going to leave how the Europeans are doing to you and Diana. How are the Europeans doing?
Well, I guess that Diana and I do represent different parts of Europe. Diana represents good Europe, proactive Europe, and forward-thinking Europe, a Europe which wants Ukraine to prevail, which is on to Bill's point. And I guess in some respects, I represent a more procrastinating, uncertain Europe. Because yes, although we've done more than ever before, that is empirically true, that's also very self-congratulatory, and it doesn't understand that the scale of a challenge and that there is so much more to be done. And yes, it's a fear of, I can't remember who said it earlier, it's a fear of escalation, for sure. That still prevails. Fear of a Ukrainian victory, actually, the uncertainty of what a Ukrainian victory would I know it's counterintuitive, of what a Ukrainian victory would bring. But I also think it's founded, in my part of Europe, on an ill-founded pessimism. The Venn diagram between those who think that it can't be done and those who think it shouldn't be done is actually a perfect circle. It's not a Venn diagram at all. It's an amazing coincidence. And so the problem I feel in my Europe it's not the apologists. I mean, David, you and I sometimes, because we hate each other, because we send each other articles from, Sharap or Leven and that kind of stuff to taunt each other. And that's good sport and it's fun. But I think, in a sense, they're not the problem. I think the problem is actually people who are outwardly reasonable people, good people, well-versed in international relations, but nonetheless, they're looking for a deal. Nonetheless, they're looking for a realistic outcome. Because to a phrase, you always know that when somebody says they're going to do the realistic thing, they're going to do a very bad thing, right? And I think that is the problem. And of course, they therefore paint us, everyone in this courtyard really, as the idealists. And therefore, they like to look like statesmen and stateswomen. So they talk about EU membership for Ukraine, good, but as part of the deal, not as now or as a part of a victory prize in a sense. They talk about giving weapons to Ukraine to put Ukraine in a better position, not for Ukraine to prevail, Bill. So, they just can't help themselves into talking like mandarins and diplomats of the worst order, if that makes any sense. But I do maintain, it's very unfortunate that they come across as reasonable people, and in a sense that's what makes them a bit more dangerous. And ultimately, I guess what really defines them and what differentiates them from us is they just don't understand either Russia or Ukraine. So reasonableness is dangerous. I think it has to be said, in fairness, that other equities do compete. We are 2 years, 6 months, 2 weeks and 1 day in. Is that right? 925 days. You see, we all forget now, and it has become normalized. Again, not in the Scandinavian, Nordic, I should say, not in the Nordic and Baltic countries where it's front page news every day. But you know, look, I have no problem with The Economist, which puts Sudan on the front page of its issue this week. That is, it's a reasonable thing, but it is emblematic. It is redolent of the idea, but there are so many other competing issues in the world on these people's plates, and I just find it very hard to compete for oxygen in the small institute where I work, which I didn't find in the first 200 days. 925 days, it's a different matter. So, and again, and I think that we are the only people who there's a Sting song, Russians, right? And in that line, he talks about there's no such thing as a winnable war. It's a lie we don't believe anymore. I mean, no offense to Sting, but that's crap. And so, but the question is, do we have it in us? Do we have enough faith in Western politicians to get to that order? And that is that is very much open to question for me. So I'm sorry to be the pessimist. Maybe Diana will have better things to say.
So Diana, over to your part of Europe.
Yeah, well, I think a lot has been done, and if you look at it from a sort of development or aid bureaucrat, you'd be really content, and you would point at the quite extraordinary resource mobilization that has been done. If you look at UN humanitarian appeals, if you talk about economic aid and economic support and humanitarian aid and development aid, you'd point at UN humanitarian appeals are better filled up than in most conflicts. You would point at a lot of the EU countries that are big donors and big spenders in development aid have really geared up their spending on Ukraine, and just like the US, for instance, Sweden has made Ukraine as the largest recipient of our development aid. Well, I'm not a development aid bureaucrat, and having said that, there is, I mean, for instance, it's deeply troubling that the G7 leaders can't deliver on the promise of the $50 billion asset freeze related to the central bank. We have seen a lot of extensive macro financial support packages from the EU side, but each and every discussion has been, just like in the US, quite troublesome. And my point would be, we have zero reasons to be content with what we have. The needs are growing by the day, and each and every rocket or missile that penetrates through the Ukrainian air defense makes this more expensive to rebuild, and not to mention all the lives lost that cannot be economically compensated or ever rebuilt. So I think and there are a lot of uncertainties hovering over us for the future, and I think it's also, my point would be that every day this war is prolonged, the risks are greater, and the consequences are dearer, and it goes back to what was said before, that in the end, whatever we do on the economic and financial and humanitarian side, as long as we don't provide military equipment enough for Ukraine to win this war, we will always, I mean, it will be suboptimal, so to speak. If we could invest that money and those funds in helping then Ukraine win also the peace, because that would be the next chapter. That would be just so much better.
Sevgil, let me ask you, Diana touched on this. No one wants this war to end more than Ukrainians.
True.
They are the ones who are fighting for freedom and their land and their lives, and tragically they're dying on a regular basis. You touched on this a little bit. How important was this move into Kursk in changing not just the narrative, but in giving motivation, additional motivation to the Ukrainians that there is a way forward?
You're absolutely right that Ukrainians are more interested to win this war as all nations. And of course, when I usually hear the word Ukraine's fatigue, first of all, Ukrainian people are tired because of war. And I think that Kursk operation was very important in perspective that it gave us a little bit a moral boost that we can do. But yeah, I want to mention maybe the importance of asymmetric answers to Russian aggression. And actually, Kursk operation is about asymmetric answers and about creativity. And of course, it's difficult to defeat Russia, which is 5 or 15 times bigger Ukraine and all Ukrainian allies. That's why we have to do something with creativity. We have to find new solutions. And Kursk operation is one of these points. The second one, innovation. A lot of people discuss innovation. All wars in the past and in the future, like maybe, they started with the old weapons and finished with the new one. And here I think we still have a lot of things to do. We have a lot of things to achieve with innovation. Because, for example, when the war started, Russia attacked Ukraine with Soviet tanks. And Ukraine had a permission to attack, for example, with FPV drones, which, for example, $300 cost of this FPV can damage a tank with the cost with $3 million. But now, of course, Russia also learned from us, and they use drones. I think that in the future, I think that what I want to say, that we need to invest more in common innovation on military tech. And it depends from different countries, it depends from other partners. Our Commander-in-Chief, Valery Zaluzhny, he mentioned that thanks to AI, it maybe could happen. And that's why I think that it will bring some importance to your society as well, and it will help in future protect your societies, and it will be deterrent for other countries maybe in the future to attack or not to attack, to achieve these new technologies and to find the new creativity lessons. So from this perspective, you're right that Kursk was very important. What it will bring to us in 1 month, let us see. But I think that more creativity, more experience will definitely help us, and strong coalition as well. So we all dream that we will have more and more support, and actually war is not only on the battlefield. There are a lot of layers of this war, economic, and still Russia is able to protect themselves with a sanction policy. They really good with living during the sanction time. For example, one of Russian opposition journalists told me that Gabon, which is African country, became the #1 exporter to Russia with some details to air jets for the oligarchs, for example, and they're growing with that. And a lot of countries help Russia now to avoid the sanctions. So we have to do something with sanction policy. Of course, Ukraine sacrificed the most important, the lives of our people, the life of our soldiers. And I do believe that other countries could definitely do something with that, to sacrifice the money, to sacrifice the trade, for example, because there are still a lot of things here to manage, to do.
Oleg, let me ask you, putting on your old diplomatic hat. Foreign Minister Kuleba was in China recently. There are plans for another summit to convene to talk about the way forward. What is the diplomatic strategy in dealing with this situation?
Frankly speaking, I am far enough from the current government, so for me it's difficult to tell. But I would like to say that I think that I do believe that any attempts to persuade China not to support Russia are doomed to failure, because militarily, strategically, ideologically, name it what, China is definitely interested in supporting Russia, and I don't see any reason for China to change her mind anytime soon. So I think that if we speak about the issue of dismantling regime of circumventing sanctions, definitely the most important role lies not with Ukraine but with our Western partners, and first of all the United States. I'm speaking about secondary sanctions. Plus we should look at this network realistically and see it in broader terms. It's not only about 5 countries, if I'm not mistaken, mentioned on the Treasury website, it's much more, and many former Soviet republics, newly independent states, are involved in that, so the pressure should be put on them. It's difficult to imagine how China can be influenced, maybe entities of China, banks, and those who are pivotal to maintaining this regime. But the pressure definitely can be put on those countries of the former Soviet Union, which I mentioned, on Turkey, on some Arab countries. Here I see the possibility for actually, if not totally resolving, but making some drastic measures to dismantle this regime, which allows Russia war machine to function. Maybe very shortly about Kursk. I think that what has been said is absolutely true. But for me, I'm not a military expert, it's really important that this operation ends as successfully as it started and as it develops now. And here, the possibility for the West really to show that the view of the situation has changed, not only in words, but in practice. And if you're speaking about the long-range missile, that's actually time of doing, Biden said, the time of essence. And finally, I would like to say that basically the paradigm should be changed. So far, we, Ukraine, our partners, were afraid of Putin and were subject to his blackmailing. What he said, how he moved, is it a double of Putin or Putin himself? It should be changed so that Putin will be fearful of us and our partners. And without that, it's really also difficult to imagine the victory.
Well, as I understand it, but correct me if I'm wrong, the United States government found out about the Kursk move as it was happening. The Ukrainians did not give us advance notice, in part, I think, because they worried we would discourage them from doing it. What does that say about the level of trust between the United States and Ukraine these days?
So the United States trusts Ukraine. There's no doubt. There's no doubt. The question is, do the Ukrainians trust us to keep secrets? And the answer is no. You know, we've got Air Force sergeants who are putting things on the internet. So we don't keep secrets very well. And yeah, I bet there was some hesitation to tell, didn't want to get no for an answer on that. But the very day that we did find out, we made another announcement of another $125 million in security assistance for Ukraine, indicating that we support.
Let me ask you one follow-up question. The prospects for additional U.S. assistance.
Yeah.
Congress, after months of delay, passed a $61 billion assistance package. I think there's also concern in Ukraine about the possibility that there won't be additional big packages coming.
Yeah, I think that's misplaced concern. I'm looking around to see if Tom Malinowski is in the audience here, but there he is. Tom is going to address. I asked this question of Tom last night on your table, and he said, Bill, it depends on what happens in November. Fair point. However, he also said, and I'm putting words in your mouth there, Tom, sorry. He said, it is certainly possible to have, you can't rule out another. You probably can rule out another supplemental before the election. But after the election could be, depending on how the election goes, the next Congress could do. Tom points out, it's not just the presidency, it's also the House and the Senate. But the American people continue to support Ukraine by 60%. And oppose Russia by the same. So the support is there, and it can happen. So dismissal of another one is premature.
James, what more can the West do about the assistance that Russia receives from these like-minded bad actors, from North Korea, from Iran, from China as well? What can we do about that? Because if you think about it, without Iranian Shahed drones early in the war, Russia would have been in much worse shape than it is. The ammunition North Korea is providing, the dual technology from China. Is there anything more we can do, and how do the Europeans view, they view Iran differently, certainly, than the United States?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one. And one of the answers might be that actually you cannot do it. You can't solve everything all at once, and you should concentrate on what it is that you can do. We seem to have very little influence on North Korea. vanishingly so on China, etc. I know Andrea Kendall-Taylor's written extensively about whether you can hedge, whether you can bring China more on side against Russia. She seems to doubt it. I think I'd broadly agree. So I think we do have to look at the limits of the possible. I think my own view, for what it's worth, is that it's, look to yourselves, play the ball, make sure that you're getting everything right in your own house. Not so much your own house in order, because our house will never be in order. This is Europe. It's 32. That's not possible. It's structurally flawed. But nonetheless, the EU does, for all its faults, and I have a healthy disrespect for it, bearing in mind its structural flaws, but it does kind of get there in the end by a legal process. Whether that's fast enough for Ukraine, frankly, is absolutely an open question. But I would nonetheless concentrate on some of the stuff that Oleh said in terms of what, I'd have a lot more sympathy if we hadn't depleted, I'd have a lot more sympathy if we had depleted our stocks. We haven't. If we had tightened, it's not, there's 13 or 14 packages of sanctions, but it should be much more useful to put secondary sanctions on countries which are through feeding it to Russia. And I think those would begin to have an effect, because I do think I hate to say this in this audience, but we do underestimate Russia. Its economy is doing pretty well right now because the war economy is feeding the war. It's going to grow by 3% this year. I also think there's a softness to Russia as well, by the way, so I don't want to big up Russia too much here. And so I think there are areas where we can make a soft Russia softer, but possibly not through those actors which are in that arc of whatever you want to call it.
Let me just push you a little bit on that. There must be ways, and I know the next panel will get into this, but there must be ways to tighten the screws on Russia to force it even more.
Yeah, so you can lower the oil price cap for a start, and that will immediately, that is one of Russia's most significant sources of income, and that works there. I do think secondary sanctions, whilst obviously they would hit Western banks quite severely, I mean, at the end of the day, sanctions are all about sacrifice. Yes, it hurts them and it hurts you, and I think we have not fully admitted that to ourselves, that sanctions are, because they're anti-trade, then they are going to hurt receiver and sender. But of course, that's not a message that politicians particularly like to convey to publics, especially not in day 925.
Diana, there's been a lot of concern about the energy situation in Ukraine, Russia targeting energy sources and refineries and so on. What can the EU do to help alleviate what might be an incredibly dire situation when it comes to winter in Ukraine this year?
Well, a lot of things are being done in order to support the energy sector. I read the other day that the US is launching a huge package in that direction, and we have been doing the same. But in the end, it goes back to, I mean, how do we secure that this infrastructure is not hit in the first place? And that goes back to air defense.
And does the EU recognize the gravity of the situation?
I think so.
Okay.
But again, I mean, I do think we all recognize the gravity of the situation in Ukraine, full stop. But then again, it's sort of, it is having that insight and then actually being able to step up to that challenge.
And a question.
And there is a discrepancy here.
A question to both of you before we'll turn to the audience in just a few minutes. The additional sanctions might be coming from the EU, and there has been consistent unity within the EU on this. Do you see any problems emerging as a result of either elections in various countries, changes in government, or Orban being Orban?
Yeah, I think this is yet another reason why we should not, I mean, we really need to speed up in terms of help supporting Ukraine to win the war, because also with each and every day, apart from the obvious costs in Ukraine, economic loss, lives lost, etc., you have the risks of dwindling support. And we already see that there is less interest in Ukraine now, and media has turned elsewhere. Not completely, but still, you have that. It's a pattern we've seen elsewhere. So, and the same then goes for support among populations in Europe. I'm lucky to come from Sweden, where we have a fantastic, phenomenal support and 8 parties in parliament all firmly behind Ukraine. But as you pointed out, it's not the situation in each and every country, and therefore I think it's yet another reason to just step up.
So as you're talking to a Brit, and not in the EU, I guess it's incumbent upon me to say that we finally have a stable government, whose one point of continuity from the Tory government is the Ukraine policy, and then one point of difference in that continuity, if that makes any sense, is that the Labour Party has agreed to achieve 3% of spending of GDP on defence, but not said when, whereas the Tories say it's by 2030. I think it's great to have that. It's great to have a human rights lawyer in charge, not a banker. And on the other hand, David Lammy has written about progressive realism, which strikes me as being a kind of a contradiction in terms a little bit. I guess again, it's about your faith in politicians, which extends, the Western world over. But I can't help but think a little bit that whilst this government is absolutely committed to assist Ukraine for as long as it takes, to use the old term, it's not committed to do whatever it takes, and it's not willing to go that far, and you certainly don't really hear that.
Okay, let's go to the audience for questions, and if anyone can create a solar eclipse, that would also be much appreciated.
It's not so bad. It's not so bad.
Where you're sitting, it may not be so bad. I'm roasting up here. Right here, Delabor.
Thank you. Dalibor Rohach, American Enterprise Institute. I have a question for specifically the Ukrainian members of the panel. How concerned should one be about the effect of an extended, prolonged war on the health of Ukraine's democracy and on its accession process towards the EU and the reforms that are necessary? Specifically, wartime requires extraordinary policies, extraordinary measures, state control over the economy. We've seen restrictions placed on broadcasting, on the TV market in particular, in the absence of the release valve that's provided by elections. Is this a concern that you have, that the longer this goes on, the harder it will be for Ukrainians to kind of refocus back on the sort of homework that Ukraine needs to do in order to become a successful European country, or is this concern completely misplaced?
And I think there was a question, Ian.
Easy one.
Ian, and we'll take that one there, and then we'll come to the panel.
Yeah, Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform. So my question actually is the Western participants, which is, we're talking about tightening sanctions in terms of secondary sanctions, but what are we doing to crack down on Western firms that are, to use a phrase that I've used before, curiously incurious about why, for example, their exports of sanctioned goods to Georgia have increased by 620%. Or firms like the firm formerly known as Schlumberger, which have made clear that they are not going to do anything to damage their Russian business of supporting Russian oil extraction. Is there actually, rather than sort of focusing on countries like Turkey and Kyrgyzstan and so on, should we not actually be concentrating on the firms that are in our jurisdictions where we can apply the thumb screws a bit more effectively?
And I think there was a hand back there. I can't see who it is, but yeah. And then we'll come to you guys.
And ask them for the sanctions.
Okay, hello, I'm Gian Nodia from here, Ilia State University. So my question is about a topic which was discussed to some extent, but I wanted a little bit more specifics maybe. The West sort of opposed the idea of Ukraine carrying out any military operations on Russian territory because it would supposedly lead to escalation, and escalation meant kind of going to the nuclear stage. Certainly that's what usually implied. Now we see that the war has been taken to the Russian territory. There is no nuclear war, and the West accepted that new reality, basically. And tacitly Putin also accepted that. But still I keep hearing that Ukrainians sort of ask the West to allow doing certain things that the West does not, supposedly, right? So could anybody be more specific on that? What is it that Ukrainian army, its military leadership would like to do militarily, but does not because it's not allowed by the West? And what it is that the West still does not allow, and why? Is it about hitting Kremlin directly, or what is it?
So actually, I will try to start with the third question. So the answer knows only the military command of Ukraine and counterparts in the West. So I presume they somehow negotiate the terms of engagement, deployment of the Western arms and Western equipment. What we need now, definitely now the restrictions have been a bit moved aside. Speaking about the United States, they have, after the offensive of Russia in the Kharkiv region, they allowed to make attacks over the border on the Russian territory within the scope of the operation to counter Russia. And also the French and the Germans allowed to reach, during also this situation near Kharkiv, to hit Russian emplacements of the rockets that were targeting Ukrainian territory. What we need now, actually, we need and you mentioned that we need to lift restrictions on the Western, first of all, long-range rocket systems to get into deep into the Russian territory, and first of all, to prevent Russian attacks by, first of all, also by rocket systems, but also by Russian infantry, mechanized infantry on the Ukrainian territory. And the whole discussion, I said it, for me it seems to be absurd. It's also to deny the fact that it's a long, full-scale war. And during the war, Ukrainian armed forces should be entrusted with using the Western equipment how they think it should be used. And I think it's also important within the logics of the Kursk operation to ensure its successful continuation.
And I think it's coming. As I say, the strategic goal is now clearer. And the concern about escalation, as you point out, and as Bill Burns has said, has down. I mean, the Kursk operation has demonstrated that you can invade Russia and not be worried about it.
I'm less optimistic, but I hope.
You're always less optimistic. That's okay. That's okay. But the trend is, in the United States government, that you wait a long time, you debate it, and you wring your hands. Finally, you make the right decision. You know, it's Javelins, it's HIMARS, it's, it's Abrams, it's F-16s, it's ATACMS, it's firing into Russia.
Unfortunately, one step too late.
It's always too late. I take that point, but it's coming. And I know that debate is now going on within the administration, and they will make it soon.
I have trust in you.
You do. You should.
Okay. Thank you. I will start with the nuclear threat, and then we'll answer the question about civil society and the threat for Ukrainian democracy. First of all, I feel myself very strange when people ask about this question, what will happen next when you go to the Kursk, Russia will use nuclear weapons. First of all, I want you to remind that actually Ukraine gave its nuclear arsenal in 1994. It was Budapest Memorandum that was signed, and you gave us all promises that you will protect us, all partners. Among these partners, among these people were actually, the countries was Russia, actually. And this is very strange when the big country blackmails the whole world with this nuclear weapon threat. So that means that we actually in a weak position here. And what will happen next after the end of Ukraine's Russia war? What will happen? We will learn the lesson that anyone could blackmail. What will happen with nuclear safety in the future? So it means that small states will definitely think about we should do something with our nuclear protection. We want to live in this world? I mean, not. So I feel myself a little strange when, for example, don't go to your native, I'm from Crimea. So for me, this war started 10 years ago with occupation of my native land. So, and people say, okay, don't go to Crimea because Russia will use nuclear weapons. Don't go to Kursk, Russia will use. Okay, we already crossed all these lines and it didn't happen. So please, maybe we have to do something with our sanction policy against all this nuclear blackmail that Russia can achieve. And answering your question on civil society, democracy, yes, we have this discussion, and a lot of speakers here told today that this is the war for the right to exist, our country, for the existential war. Yes, it is. It's very important. But still, this is war for the right to be independent, to be democratic, and to be transparent and European country. That's why I usually say that we are still democracy at war, and we are fighting with one of the biggest authoritarian states. And I think the only way how we can do that with our democratic values, with our partners, and of course with following all these values. There are still some threats, you're absolutely right, because we live under martial law. There are a lot of restrictions. And I think in this situation, it's very important to support civil society, because Ukraine has a very strong civil society, and here you will see other representatives of civil society. It's very important to support independent journalism. Even in circumstances of war, we're still able to criticize the government. We are still able to investigate some misconducts, corruption, and bad governance. And this is a good sign that for us, this is a very important homework. You're absolutely right, and we have to do during the war. So when I, as a journalist, cover the front line, I have to think about that I have to cover what's happening with all procurement in Ministry of Defense. And actually, journalists did in my country that work, and it helped us to achieve some good results too. So I will end that I'm more optimistic, but at the same time, from some of members of parliament, I often hear that the only one opposition left in the country are independent journalists. So they can criticize the government, they can also provide some positive changes. So, and maybe I will finish that. Actually, I was 17 years old student when the Maidan started in 2004. Then in 2014, I was 27. Then I'm 37 now, and it's still democratic transformation of the country is happening. So it's not even the question of like political elite. This is a question of our generation, and we will definitely proceed to this. And we will. This is our dream to live in European democratic country, please, and we will do everything possible. But you can just help us with the support of civil society and independent journalism.
So maybe I would try also to add a bit. So we shouldn't forget that this war is actually not about the territorial integrity, independence. It's also about defending Ukrainian European democratic choice. And I would say that people do care about democracy, even in the time of war. It's important for them. They do care about the change, real change in the country going on during the war. And they understand that the more democratic change we see in the country, more efficient is our government, better would be our efficiency in terms of military response. That is clear, and we do care about that. And the victory of Ukraine, I believe, would be measured not only by military victory, military success, but also to which extent Ukraine going out of the war will be changed, and changed according to our choice of the European model of development.
Yeah, I could comment on the sanctions and Ian's questions. Well, effective restrictive measures represent, of course, a key instrument to limit Russia's ability to wage war. And we've been quite active in pushing for more sanctions. I lost track of how many sanction packages the EU has put forward and managed to push through at this point in time. But regardless, I think your point is absolutely right. I mean, what we need to work on three ends, both more sanctions to Russia, closing loopholes both in third countries, but also at home in our respective countries, because there is definitely more to be done there.
So, yeah, to answer Ian's question, I mean, he effectively answered it himself. So very briefly, I mean, look, a confession. So my family loves Marmite. You know what Marmite is? It's the yeasty-like spread you put on toast and bagels. Unilever makes Marmite, and it's the only people who do. And Gobo Low, Vegemite is not the same, okay? So, and Unilever refuses to stop operating in Russia. So I feel that whenever my family is eating Marmite, that we're funding the bloody Russian war effort, and I can't stop them. But and it is a real problem. I mean, you know, and they'll say, oh yeah, but Russia needs diapers. But again, do we care that much? A really interesting question is pharma. Pharmaceuticals are still operating in Russia now. You would, I mean, I recognize there are ethical questions involved here, but what is the betting that some of those pharmaceuticals are not going to help Russian soldiers at the front to recover from their injuries inflicted upon them? I would argue that we shouldn't be sending pharmaceuticals to Russia, but I think if I were to argue that in most Western European countries, I think I'd be knocked down for being an unethical bastard.
Unfortunately, my apologies to the front row here who had questions. I think we are out of time, but let me just say the last comments are a perfect segue to the next panel. The situation in Ukraine strikes me as the critical issue we all face today. And it is not just Ukraine's war, it is our war. And it is incumbent upon all of us to do everything we can to help Ukraine win, to defeat Russia. And the repercussions of that, should that follow, are enormous for Belarus, for Moldova, for Georgia, Armenia, and for Russia itself. And so to me, it seems that the best course of action, given the tremendous determination and courage of Ukrainians, including those who are represented here at this conference, is to do everything we can to help them to victory. This is a pivotal year for a lot of places, I think no more than for Ukraine than anywhere else. So please join me in thanking a terrific panel here. We will transition, so don't go away, to holding Putin and Russia accountable, so stay tuned.
Sure.
Please grab your seats so we can get started. Our next panel follows very nicely from the preceding one. Whoever did this agenda was brilliant. Moderating this panel will be my friend and former colleague, Colleen Graffy with Pepperdine University's Caruso School of Law. Colleen.
Thank you very much, David. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Colleen Graffy, as you heard, law professor with Pepperdine University, and we have an all-star panel this afternoon, starting with, I believe he's known as the wise man of Washington. That would be Daniel Freed, who served 40 years as in the career foreign service, amongst many things, senior director at the National Security Council, ambassador to Poland, assistant secretary of state for Europe and Eurasia, and I hear that you worked with a dream team as deputy assistant secretaries with you, and also, of course, now with the Atlantic Council. We also have Daria Kaleniuk, executive director of the Anti-Corruption Action Center, a very powerful organization shaping anti-corruption legislation in Ukraine. And I believe Daria might be doing a side business in T-shirts. If we can get a close-up on that T-shirt, make Russia small again. She's taking orders. Excellent. We also have Rihards Kols, Latvian politician, former chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and now, congratulations, 2024, elected as a member of the European Parliament. To his right, we have Marko Mihkelson, former journalist, former editor-in-chief of the biggest national daily newspaper in Estonia, member of the Estonian Parliament and chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And also with the journalistic background, we have Brian Whitmore. The journalism background includes many years with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, also on the academic side as a professor in practice. The very powerful podcast, if you haven't heard it, the Power Vertical podcast, and Brian is with the Atlantic Council as well. To start us off, of course, as a law professor, I have to point out that one of the most significant document in our international world order is the United Nations Charter. And the key article in the UN Charter is Article 2.4, which says that all members of the United Nations shall refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state. And here we have Russia, the crime of crimes, the crime from which all others flow, the crime of aggression has been committed. How are we holding Russia accountable? What are we doing to hold Russia accountable? We will start with Dan Freed for his overview. Thanks, Dan. Oh, your mic's on.
Oh, okay. Hold Russia accountable, one, by helping Ukraine win, prevail, as the Biden administration now says, but also hit the Russian economy and mean it. There was a discussion, the discussion in the last panel set it up. So there are additional steps we can take on sanctions. Okay, I'm going to go through some of them to be real specific and concrete. One, God damn it, get the deal done on using the accumulated interest on Russian frozen assets. The G7 agreed to do it in July. That's a big deal. Now, weeks after, they don't have a decision that verges on dithering. The G7 leaders agreed to it. Do it. There may be some lawyers, I'm sure there are some lawyers and some financial people who are uncomfortable. I really don't care. Okay? They agreed to it. So get it done. Number two, the Russian oil price cap has had an impact. It has deprived the Russian economy of resources. But there is much more that can be done On this, I'm going to demur. There are things specifically that I have in mind and that the Biden administration is considering, but they need to be creative and take the next step. I understand that in an election year, the people are worried about a spike in crude oil prices, but there are ways to get around this. And part B of energy, try to kill the Russian LNG industry, which some of the people at the State Department are enthusiastically going after. 3, on financial sanctions, flip the script, by which I mean don't debate which banks we should add, hit all Russian banks, put every single one under financial restrictions, and then have a license list for permitted transfers. Food, medicine, specific goods. Flip the script. A presumption of prohibition and sanction against every Russian bank. That sounds extreme, but if you actually think about it, we've gone after most of the Russian banks. It's time to go after all of them 100%. 3, the last panel discussed the third country transfer of a lot of Russian products. Like, why are all these cars going to Georgia or Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan when they're making their way through to Russia? You know, that's nice, but actually, you know, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan is not actually the problem. What was it, Ian Bond said that manufacturers are showing a curious lack of curiosity about where their stuff goes? Yeah, no kidding. Work upstream, go to manufacturers. Banks in the West have developed over the last almost 25 years, a culture of sanctions compliance. They put on a lot of people, they devote a lot of resources. A lot of manufacturers pretend they don't know where it's going. Oh my goodness, my turbines ended up in Crimea. Who could have known? I'm shocked. In such situations, in my old sanctions office at State, the term we used inside was put some heads on a pike, which means locate a Western manufacturer who is acting in bad faith, who knows or should have known or could have known with elementary due diligence where their stuff was going. And don't pick any old product. Pick something like fancy machine tools or chips and go after them. Go upstream, okay? Final, and this is something that Ann Applebaum has recently written about, and she's right, as she usually is. Let us all clean up our act, okay? Financial transparency. The British are guilty of this. Yeah, how about Delaware corporations? You know, it is financial opacity. No one should have the right to own millions, billions of dollars worth of property in the name of some fictitious shell corporation. Transparency is clear, and there's nobody clean. The advantage of nobody being clean is that the Americans can't point fingers at anybody. We all have to take this step together, okay? And mean it. So I've tried to be policy specific in answer to your question.
Thank you, Dan. Excellent. And sort of a follow-on question is, many view that these sanctions come into place and then the oligarch has shifted money to an ex-wife or someplace else and view these sanctions as something that's static and it's playing whack-a-mole. How often are you able to, is the U.S. government able to update these sanctions? How quickly does it move? And how do you get the information on who to sanction in case people have any tips after the conference?
Yeah, I mean, there's an actual answer to that question. First of all, the Biden administration has done a pretty good job in what I call sanctions maintenance, that is, hitting evaders, plugging loopholes, going after companies. But to see what I mean, take a look at the last sanctions list that the State Department put out. I think it was last week, maybe the week before. I mean, it's a long list. But go on the OFAC website or the State Department website, because they now issue these things in parallel, and there's some overlap but not complete. That's good stuff. But what I'm talking about is actual escalation. Change the game. You got to do both, but you can do it. And you're going to have to engage in what are called secondary sanctions, and that's a fancy term. What it means is we're going after Russia in our Russia sanctions program, but if there is, to pick a country completely at random with no significance, if an Austrian bank is playing footsie with sanctioned Russian banks, you go after that bank, okay? And that's called secondary sanctions, and you have to pick your targets judiciously, but go after them. Our risk tolerance should be commensurate with the violation, and it's a big, real war in Ukraine. So all policymakers, you know this, look for all gain, no pain, risk-free options, and hint, they don't actually exist.
Thank you so much. Daria, what is your take on how we hold Putin and Russia accountable?
Let's start with the question that it's Russia, not just Putin. Because there are hundreds, thousands of little Putins which are making missiles, which are being fired at Ukrainian orphanages, schools, hospitals, critical infrastructure. There are hundreds, thousands of little Putins which are at our land, trying to destroy our right of existence. So it's not Putin. We have to hold Russia accountable. Also, we have to recognize in our mind that all that started not on February 24, 2022, and not even in 2014. In Ukraine, we clearly remember August 8, 2008 in Georgia, where Russia violated the charter. And no one reacted properly. It was like, okay, it's normal. No sanctions, business as usual, let's deal with Russia. Let's build more joint pipelines because Russian cheap gas is important for the prosperity of Europe. And that encouraged Russia. That impunity and lack of accountability encouraged Russia because everybody thought that, okay, Russia is too big to be punished, so let's make Russia small again. We have to make Russia small again, first of all, in our minds. And what Ukrainians are doing now in Kursk is actually changing the perspective in our minds, that Russia can be small, Russia can be defeated, Russia can be occupied for the defensive purposes in Ukraine. Then coming to the very practical steps, how to hold Russia accountable now, in the midterm and the long term. So now, 50 billion decision is good, but honestly it takes so long, and I can't until now understand why we can't seize now immediately all 300 billion of Russian sovereign assets, most of which are being stored in France and Belgium. So all this, I'm a lawyer myself, but I don't understand neither legal argument nor financial argument. It's just, you know, when European Union is saying that they can't take this decision, I'm thinking, okay, is it the union of scared? Or it's the union of people who believe in democracy and ready to fight for that? And when there are discussions in Germany or in the United States about, you know, the burden on taxpayers in the EU and in America, so much aid has to be sent to Ukraine, so many billions, and we are saying, okay, we are fine with it. We understand it's a burden on the taxpayers, but there is Russian money. Just take it. Send it to Ukraine. Let's set up foundation. It can be only even in Brussels. And make out of 300 billion a trillion. And then Ukraine will have money to build drones to make Russia accountable.
So, Daria, just to be specific, hasn't the agreement been that we can freeze the assets, but seizing the assets is complicated and problematic, but taking the interest would be more amenable to most countries? And wasn't there an agreement that we can go with the interest rather than actually seizing the asset itself?
It is running away from responsibility and of taking the risk. Of course it is risky, but what's the alternative? Making Ukraine fail? From the legal point of view, and most of international lawyers are saying it is doable. From legal construction allows that to happen. Financial argument, okay, G7 countries, they cover 97% of all the international transactions in foreign currency. So if all G7 together decide to seize that, nothing will be harmed. So I can't understand why your European Union is so exposed to the pressure from Saudis, who are saying, okay, if you seize that, we're going to take all our investments from Europe. I think, yeah, you take this risk, but what's the alternative? Making Ukraine just fail? And what will then it cost? So I think it's a time of taking some leadership and proactive leadership and taking some risks for the European Union and for countries in Europe. In America, the Repo Act was adopted. Nothing prevents the United States now from actually seizing these 5 billion assets which are there. And this is the concept which we are having. Make Russia pay for this war and make Russia pay for Russia being defeated by Ukrainians. And we can produce more weapons. We don't have money in Ukraine to produce more weapons, long-range drones and missiles, etc. If we have this money from Russia, we can do that. And it's not only this 300 billion which we can seize, but there are other options how to force Russia pay. All these companies which still are dealing with Russia and which are headquartered and have their legal entities across Europe and America, they have to pay additional tariff. The tax of war and the tax for war profiteering. And these also have to go to the fund which has to support Ukraine, support protection of the critical infrastructure in Ukraine, and support of building weapons in Ukraine, for Ukraine. As for the sanctions, on Monday last year, there were 236 air targets, particularly targeting critical infrastructure of Ukraine, all over 4 nuclear power plants. And if it is a secret for you, we were close to the nuclear collapse. And there has to be proper reaction of the international community saying, the attack on the transformers, these huge transformers, 750 kilowatts transformers, which are transforming electricity from the nuclear power plant, has to be equal to using the nuclear weapons. And that the consequences will be as there was used nuclear weapons, but there is no statement like that. One more attack like that, and there could be real nuclear explosion. But Rosatom was also not sanctioned. So there is so much we still can do, and Europe still can do, to help us in Ukraine to hold Russia accountable with the power of force. As a lawyer, I don't believe in the power of conventions anymore or agreements. I believe in the power of weapons and the power of strong army, which can say Russia that it's actually small.
But so we better go directly to the European Union. I know you're just coming in, but
I'm a freshman.
As a freshman. But what's the view from the EU? What should we be doing to hold Putin and Russia accountable?
Well, even right now I represent the European Parliament. I'm still, in my heart and in my mind, a true Latvian. And you know how the Russian diplomats are calling the Latvian politicians, or the ones who are going after Russia internationally, extremely primitive hooligans. This is, I mean, that we've been coined, and why is that? Is actually, we do try to bring around international institutions by that they adhere to the principles they were founded on, like, for example, the OEC. Thank God we did manage to, well, not to expel, but at least Russia itself suspended its participation as well. And there's numerous organizations still to be on the list where Russia should be expelled. The WTO is one of those as well. I mean, it took 25 years for Russia to join the WTO, but first day on, when they joined, they started to obstruct all the international trade agreements, principles, and etc. So from accountability, I would say one thing in the West we need to start, it's both in Europe, but across the ocean as well. There are more and more increasing voices, maybe not loud, but there are in the rooms whispering, well, we need to find a way to sit at a table and maybe start to talk about first ceasefire, then maybe negotiations. Those who deny that there are such conversations are naive. There are, and they're actually increasing. The immorality of that is that if we're truthful to ourselves, when we say impunity cannot prevail, will not prevail, and we are supporting the International Criminal Court and its arrest warrant on Putin and other war criminals as well. But then we hint that we are ready actually to negotiate with the war criminal, that we ask for the International Criminal Court to trial. So this is absurdity that is happening, and I think it was yesterday, Peskov made an interview, and he was asked, okay, how does it look that, you know, the West is supporting Ukraine, now is entering Russia and so on? And he said, well, it might be entertaining in Europe, but the rest of the world is looking at things differently. And he might be right, because let's go back in 2023, February, 23rd of February, the vote at the UN. 141 countries voted condemning the act of aggression by Russia. So since then, there's no resolution being put on the floor for a vote in regards to Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And there's, you know, the systematic war crimes committed, amounting almost 70,000 cases, and nothing is actually progressing. But in the meantime, we see the only European West countries are pushing for the International Criminal Court. There is arrest warrant now on Shoigu, on Gerasimov, on Putin on different charges. But still, tomorrow is going to be a crucial day for ICC and its jurisdiction. Putin is about to visit Mongolia. Mongolia is a part of Roma statutes. If they don't arrest Putin, well, I think all eyes are now on Mongolia. It should be, and must be, but we also should, and we must send signals to Mongolia that if that is going to happen, there will be consequences. Mongolia is actually a partner country for NATO for years. Mongolia is deeply vested actually in cooperation with the European Union, with the NATO, and that might be undermined if tomorrow really Putin steps in Ulaanbaatar. Yes, there are people who are saying, well, in the past there's been cases where, you know, the ICC warrant hasn't been appealed to. But then again, ICC is somewhat a new framework, but it has the universal jurisdiction. And if we talk a rules-based international order that we want to not only keep but to maintain, this is, for accountability and impunity, a very crucial moment. Otherwise, our efforts would be really pointless, and we'll become actually a laughable stock, and somebody said the global south. I mean, we might think, and this is something where we catch ourselves in the West, that we think that the rest of the world thinks like us. No, we're actually in minority. Democracies are in minority. Democracies are actually shrinking. For the past 10 years, autocratic, semi-autocratic, autocratic wannabe countries are on the rise. So coming back on accountability, I don't want to interfere in Daniel's sphere of competences, because but one thing what I can mention, those who are saying that sanctions are not working, they do work. Just alone IMF 2022 data showed that because of the sanctions, Russia's GDP dropped by 10%. It's a huge, yes, it's not enough, but it's a huge drop. And it's, I don't know the data for 23, and not alone for 24. So sanctions do work, maybe slowly, but they do work. And the last point I wanted to make, so right now, EU finally harmonized the legislation when it comes to those who are obstructing sanctions, bypassing, now it's a criminal offense. Before that, in some member states, it was administrative fine and so on. Now it's a criminal offense. So now we have to go further. We have to go after the enablers. Daniel mentioned manufacturers, the companies, but we should go after those who consult, those who want to violate the sanctions. You know, lawyers companies, lobbyist companies, and they're in their hundreds, and they are profiting from all of this. So this is another step. Well, I know Marko mentioned I talk a lot. So I guess I'll stop here.
I think that's an excellent point about Mongolia and putting pressure on Mongolia now in hopes that we see Putin on the Zoom screen instead of going there in person. I also note it was a fantastic moment when the UN General Assembly voted to condemn, but let's remember there were also, wasn't it 34 nations that abstained. You know, 34 nations, why could they not, how could they not see this as an aggression, and how did they not have the wherewithal to condemn Russia about that? It's very troubling. Marko, what's the view from the Foreign Affairs Committee and Estonia?
Yeah, thank you, Colleen. Great to be back in Tbilisi, such a pivotal moment. You know, I get a little bit sick and tired that, participating talks about how to make Russia accountable. It's obvious, it should be even not on consideration what we should do. My question is, and the worry is that we have not been critical enough towards our own governments, towards our own action, actually, not only during last 2.5 years, but during more than 20 or 30 years. I think that we have to realize and look into the mirror and say frankly that we have so far failed massively. And this actually has emboldened Russians to do what they do today. Daria said correctly that this is, and Tobias previously also mentioned about that this war is not about Ukraine. This war is not about to change geostrategic or geopolitical reality in Eastern Europe. This is about to change world order. Putin has constantly talking about that. Last time I heard he said that during Valdai meeting in last October. And they are not alone in this adventure. They have allies, and they're building a strong alliance in terms to achieve that goal, meaning, Iran, North Korea, and China. Obviously, they are all in one and another way interested to keep Russia going on with this, what they do right now in Ukraine. And believe me, every time I meet soldiers, defenders of our freedom in Ukraine. Last time I was in Kharkiv region just 5 days ago. It is rather difficult to tell them that what we do in Europe or in the West, helping them, because they see on the ground that the promises what we keep or giving to Ukraine or to defenders of Ukraine are not fulfilled. And how come you can fight if those elementary promises are not fulfilled? Additional to that we are not able to make sure that Russia truly believes that they can be taken to the courts and being accountable. So first, what we should do is to realize that we collectively don't understand what should be our strategy yet. Yes, in Estonia, small country, we understand what is at stake. We have spent 1.8% of GDP during 2.5 years during last 2.5 years helping Ukraine militarily, financially, every other way. And we can do more. And we call up our allies to spend at least 0.25% of GDP of respective countries every year for military help to Ukraine. Just imagine if Germany, the United States, France, or other countries, the UK, could spend at least 1% of GDP for Ukraine's help, we could have already today a totally different picture on the ground. So we have to really realize that if we want to defend our world order, this is what was also discussed previously in Kurt's panel, then we have to win this war. If for that to win this war, we have to go in, we have to form coalition of willing if that is necessary. But first and foremost, as Daria said, and Ukraine has actually many times confirmed that they can win with our help this war if we really supply them everything they need, and also we don't have or will have any limitations for them to use weaponry they have or they need. So, and last but not least, perhaps, to make Russia accountable is not only possible when Western countries do that or wish that. We have to have a much wider support on global level. I don't like the terms global south, but countries in Asia, in Africa, in Middle East, and in America, they watch who will win in this war, and they will take side after that. So the first and foremost, most important is, if we want to see Putin one day in The Hague, if we want to see Russia small again, if we want to see us being strong enough to define future's world order, we have to win in Ukraine.
Thank you. Yeah, excellent. And as you say, Estonia understands what's at stake, and perhaps that's part of the problem. Other countries don't have that same concept. Taking us over to Brian.
Sure. Thank you, Colleen. First of all, I want to nod here to Richards. I think we should all embrace this extremely primitive hooligans label. Maybe Daria can get us some T-shirts made up. And along those lines, I first I want to say I agree with everything my fellow panelists have said. But I want to, in the interest of being an extremely primitive hooligan, I want to broaden the aperture a little bit here and talk about what we mean by accountability. The question of accountability, for it to be true accountability, needs to be broader than legal accountability through criminal prosecutions. It needs to be broader than economic accountability through sanctions and through reparations. These are necessary, but they're not sufficient. And I want to think about the day after victory, and how we drive home the fact that Russia has to be accountable. True accountability needs to be much broader, and it needs to be much deeper. It needs to go beyond Putin. And to Russia's current leadership, along the lines of Daria's comment earlier, that this is Russia's war, not just Putin's war. But it's broader than that. We need to hold the mindset, the culture, the theory of history that made all of this possible accountable. True accountability requires historical and cultural accountability. It requires an accounting and an indictment of the imperial and the colonial culture and the imperial and colonial historiography that has led Russia to view its neighbors, whether they are Ukrainians, Georgians, Belarusians, Moldovans, Balts, Central Asians, as inferior. And a true reading of Russian culture can only lead us to this conclusion, that Russian culture itself is imperial. So true accountability involves not just holding Vladimir Putin accountable, it involves holding Alexander Pushkin accountable. This is the intellectual ecosystem that made the horrors of Bucha possible. It's the intellectual ecosystem that made the ethnic cleansing in the Balts in the 40s that we are still feeling knock-on effects today possible. It's the intellectual ecosystem that made the invasion of Georgia and the continued state capture of Georgia possible. It's the intellectual ecosystem that's made the subjugation of Belarus possible. And this, we will only get beyond this. We will only hold Russia accountable when we re-examine Russian history and Russian culture in its entirety. Now, much of this can only be accomplished by Russians. And I'll have more to say on that in a later intervention. But I do want to say there are things that we can do in the West, those of us that teach Russian politics and Russian history, and those of us that teach Russian literature. We can change the way we teach this, because for more than a century, and I'll speak from what my academic area, the imperial version of Russian history that is taught in most American and most Western European universities is wrong. It was brought to the West by white Russian historians after the 1917 revolution and became part of our curriculums. I learned this in university. I had to unlearn it later because I was lucky enough to make friends with a Ukrainian historian that taught me that everything I learned in university was wrong, and I had to go back to school figuratively. Well, now I'm teaching in a university, and I'm trying to bring in a new curriculum that looks at the histories of these countries as independent of Russia. Georgia has its own history, independent of Russia. Ukraine certainly has its own history, independent of Russia, and we kind of need to bring this into our curriculum, because by uncritically accepting this imperial and colonial version of history that we've all been taught for generations, we have all become unwittingly Putin's little helpers. And I'll stop there.
And to come around this, this is, as you say, this is going to require the Russians taking ownership.
Yes.
Just quickly, how do you see, we're going to come to the audience questions in a moment, so if you have questions, start showing hands. How do you bring this to the Russian people, and when does this happen?
Well, I mean, the good news is
this is sort of a long-term...
It's a long-term thing. right? I mean, you and I were talking last night about maybe setting up a commission. I don't think this is something we could solve with a commission. It's got to come from here, from the Russians. And fortunately, the good news is there are Russians who are going down this path. I plug this book every time I'm on a stage because I think everybody should read it. Mikhail Zygar's book, War and Punishment, is probably the best thing I've read by a Russian about Ukraine. And I'm going to, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'm going to quote from it, if I may, because Mikhail is really, he told me he wants to start a conversation. And I said, if you're going to start this conversation, I hope you have really good security. He starts the book like this. This book is a confession. I am guilty for not reading the signs much earlier. I, too, am responsible for Russia's war against Ukraine, as are many of my contemporaries and our forebearers. Regrettably, Russian culture is also to blame for making all these horrors possible. So that Russian culture may live on, we must act. We must start by looking inside ourselves and telling the truth about our past and our present. Russian, Ukrainian, and indeed all history is made up of myths. And alas, our myths have led us to the fascism of 2022, and it's time to expose them. We are still drugged up, intoxicated by the grandeur of imperialism. We've been smoking this drug for centuries, feeding our own vanity. The myth of greatness was spooned down our throats, injected into our veins, and made us high. So this is what we need to hear from more Russians, and we need to promote the Russians who are doing this because they're brave.
That's quite the quote, and it's a good recommendation for that book. Thank you. As I move into the shade so I can see hands coming up, I just see that we've got economic sanctions that we've discussed, visa bans, frozen assets, and some lawfare and some history. And maybe there's some other thoughts out there as well. We'll go first, and we have the second microphone can go to the gentleman in the baseball cap. So first, Emmanuel. And second mic to
Thanks.
the man.
Thank you for the brilliant presentations and seeing all the musketeers. We see each other for the last 30 years after dismantled the Soviet Union, and thank God we took part in that endeavors 34 years ago. My question will be, actually, in this town we are remembering 100 years of uprisal, Tbilisi famous uprisal, when hundreds of thousands of Georgians took weapons against Bolshevik regime, and they liberated biggest part of Georgia. 5,000 after that was killed by Bolshevik army here in town. 5,000. It's more like in Czech Republic in 68, more like in Hungary. Let's commemorate the brave Georgian first uprisal when they almost become member of League of Nations in 1920s, yes? Now coming back. So about sanctions. So conferences created by Council of Europe just show how sanctions are implemented. I'm sorry to say, if we have the poster, all proletariat, if you remember Karl Marx in our cities, red poster, proletariats from all world, unite yourself. Someone can have poster, crooks from all the world, unite yourself. Well, you have thousands of companies, and I'm sorry, I'm leading the process in Council of Europe, and I would like to say that our prosecutor office and our intelligence found that more like 500 FSB, not Russian economy business units, but Russian FSB, people are working to avoid the sanctions together with all other crooks, and they becoming in the future agents of Russia. Well, all compromise material is in the hands of them. So the question is to you, how we encourage our law enforcement agencies to do what they're doing if you are Rihards or Marko, if you are not paying 20 euros taxes, you will be followed by our financial. But if our companies are avoiding the sanctions for millions of dollars, they're not under scrutiny of our law enforcement agencies. How to encourage our intelligence community and how to create in our deep state enthusiastic move to follow our companies, Lithuanian companies, Latvian, Estonian, Polish, Italian, British, American, and probably from time to time even Ukrainian. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And you'll remember that question because we're going to take a couple, all right? Sure. So the gentleman in the baseball cap, could you say your name and introduce yourself? And then could we have this mic go to the gentleman right there?
Thank you. My name is Georgi Gandelaki. I just want to thank Brian for making this point of embracing history of this region through the Russian lens and how entrenched this embrace still is and has been. And perhaps Georgia is too a victim of that phenomenon, and particularly this idea that nationalities in the Soviet Union, including Georgians, and particularly Georgians, thrived because of the Soviet nationalities policies. And Soviet Union is still viewed in parts of Western academia as an anti-colonial sort of force. So the question would be, and by the way, and thank you, Emanuelis, for mentioning the centennial of the 1924 uprising, which was a which had a bloody aftermath against the Soviet Russian occupation, which was also a form of national oppression. So, Brian, to what extent that phenomenon is entrenched in Western bureaucracy? Because this bureaucracy is also educated in the environment which you just described. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And so, Brian, you'll remember that
Yes, I
question.
will.
And can we have that mic go to the gentleman behind the tree with the tie? But meanwhile, we're going to hear from this gentleman. Can you introduce yourself?
Hello, thank you. My name is Yuri. I'm from Ukraine, and I do represent the McCain Institute alumni community here. Thank you for the point on Mongolia, by the way. But my question is on India, the biggest bidder and buyer of Russian oil, and probably one of the biggest suppliers of cash to Russian state budget. Can secondary sanctions go that far to hold this? And also, Russian shadow fleet is still operational. Can anything still be done to it? Thank you.
Okay, that shadow freak, that one will be for you, Dan. So now we'll take that mic and bring it over to this gentleman here, Nick, and then you go ahead.
Hello, I'm Vlad Galushko from the Open Society Foundations. I want to build on the point that Rihards Kols talked about, the ICC. As you know, Ukraine just ratified the Rome Statute, one of the few countries, I think, who's done it during the war. And I feel it's like the only country that is interested in fulfilling the statute. And it's the only country that is tracking Putin and where it goes. Do you think there should be some red lines that the European Union needs to start to establishing more proactively for its partners that are not willing to follow the Rome Statute? Because it is in the EU interest to do so. Thanks.
Thank you. So you'll take that one, and Marko can take the first one. Yes.
How many? Who take?
Yes, I'm Nicolas Tenza from Paris, France. Well, basically, I have two short questions. The first thing is, basically, Russia has committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, crime of genocide, and crime of aggressions against Ukraine. And before, as we know, in other countries, Syria, etc. So one of the key questions is, when you have a country committing those crimes without any statute of limitations, why do the world leaders not talking about those crimes day after day? Just not to trivialize these crimes. And I think there could be a huge effort, and the question is how to make the leaders speak each and every day about those crimes. The second point is, very shortly, is, let's be very clear. If there is not a full defeat of Russia, the punishment will never come.
Yes,
sure. Which means that we must have a clear strategy on defeating Russia, because we have to make Russia pay, not now, not in the 2 or 3 years to come, but in 20 and 30 years to come, because you have $2 trillion dollars basically of war damages to pay, without mentioning everything else. So we must have an additional tax to Russia. There must be part of a VAT that must be given to Ukraine. So there must be a long-term strategy, and it comes along certainly with the full consciousness of guilt among Russian people, because without this feeling of guilt, also nothing will happen. So we have to defeat Russia to achieve this goal. Thank you.
Okay, and let's take our last question here, and I hope everyone's remembered their questions.
Yeah. Well, tough task.
Just to continue what Nicholas has dropped off on, we Ukrainians do believe that it is about punishment of all the Russians. It is not about Russian elites. It's not about Putin. It's not about Shoigu. It's not about Lavrov. It is about them recognizing the guilt and being ready to pay for what they have done with their action or inaction to the Ukrainian people. That's one thing. But my question is, we've discussed here the sanctions, the circumvention of sanctions. How do we deal with all those countries that are trying to help to raise the trade with the Russian Federation? And we are so proud of ourselves in Europe that, well, we have cut off the Russian gas supplies through the pipelines. And then in the meantime, we've grown, well, last year it was 40%. I don't know what are the numbers of this year, the LNG imports from the Russian Federation to the countries of European Union. What do we do with this? It's just laying on the surface. How do we deal with those things where we are actually trying to say lies to ourselves?
Okay, thank you. So Emmanuel's question was the first one.
Yeah, so I can take all the others.
Okay.
Well, Emmanuel has raised what we are doing at the national level. Well, there is already more than a dozen, I would say, several dozen criminal cases open against the Latvian entrepreneurs who are actually violating the sanctions. Our enforcement of sanctions, I think, is one of the most effective within the EU because what we did several years ago, we mandated any company that is doing business in Latvia, they had to have a certain deadline to reveal their true beneficiaries. So we are very effective in applying the sanctions because we know already we can scrutinize in database and know who owns what and where, whereas in the rest of the Europe, the struggle is it is being done manually. Manually, the staff is going and looking through different databases and so on. So enforcement is slow and not effective. So that is something that can be taken from the Baltic countries as well. Well, I've been advocating, and I will continue to advocate even at the European level, at the EU level, is to close the borders for any physical movement across the border, be it the commodities, be it the trucks, whatever, be it for 2 weeks or month, and we will see the effect. And it will be crucial. And it's actually our part of the world, 5 countries that are bordering with Russia, and we can do that. It's a political will. It's not about, if it's feasible to be done. Questions on the ICC? Well, Europe is actually, EU is cooperating with Ukraine. It's called the Joint Investigation Team, where we're gathering all the evidence, actually all the 6.3 million refugees that are coming to European member states. We do, of course, cautiously, through our intelligence services, we do interview, we gather the evidence. And we actually, when it's ready, then we pass it to ICC. So there is active work being conducted. I know Ukraine has already have filed and charged 600 cases. So I mentioned already there's 70,000 already documented cases. Of course, it takes time to identify, but there is already a mechanism in place. And well, trade with Russia, again, I mentioned the gas is. There were only 4 countries in Europe left that received the gas through the pipes. It was Hungary, Slovakia, Serbia, and Austria. I don't know what you're going to do in that facility that you have taken control of. If you're going to cut off the gas as well, not only oil. I would support Ukraine in doing that because we see when the nest of the cockroaches is being hit, they start to run around and panicking. I will not name them, but everyone understands. There are, small Putins within the Europe as well. Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next question, Marko, did you have the next one?
Actually, the Rihards already touched upon that what we can do in order to enforce sanctions and really what we have agreed upon on the EU level or on national level. if you talk to the people who really are specialists and experts in that field, they say that you don't need to be a nuclear scientist how to avoid sanctions. Unfortunately, you know, we have seen the routes what are used, and actually, Rihards, you know, we can close those few borders what we have still open from EU side, but unfortunately, we cannot close China border with Russia. We cannot close. I don't know, even this part of the world is under consideration how this is used, the routes from here to Russia. But anyway, what is most important is that we are not hitting hard actually the sectors which really matter in terms of making Russia accountable or kind of their war efforts to hit. It's just incredible to know that we paying in Europe more money to Russia for fossil fuels still than we pay or for help, military help to Ukraine. How come? Where is the political kind of wisdom here? And that tells you that we don't take seriously about what is at stake. That what Nicholas said as well, that the only goal what we should have in our minds today is how to make sure that every effort we put into action, direct military help to Ukraine and sanctions and global diplomacy in that regard, should focus on that, how to make Russia defeated in this war. The Ukrainian flag above Sevastopol is something which make at least theoretical possibility that Russia will one day be accountable.
Dan, I wonder, there was that one point on the ghost ships, I think it was, and India, and the fact that basically economic sanctions are as watertight as a sieve. So any rounds up on that one?
Okay, small answer and then a larger answer. The small answer is there is more that can be done against the ghost fleet, but if you want to go after Russian oil income, we're going to have to change the sanctions structure, and there are things that can be done. There have been other oil sanctions regimes like Iran, which may have some lessons. Secondly is a larger question of whether imperfect sanctions work. And there will always be lots of articles written about the holes in sanctions, and those articles will be accurate. But I'm so old that I remember the really lousy Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan era sanctions against the Soviet Union, and the US and Europe fought like hell over it. It was a real mess and a failure. Everyone agreed it was a failure. Well, look back. How did the Soviet economy do in the 1980s? Right. Looking back, the economic pressure against the Soviet Union in the 1980s made it more difficult for the Soviet economy to escape the consequences of, as Lenin would say, its contradictions. And you see where I'm going with this. The Russian economy is under pressure. Read the Anders Osland, Jeffrey Sonnenfeld article about that pressure. No, it's not on the verge of collapse, but the strain is real and detectable. Keep it up. We don't know where the line of genuine pain is, but the Russians, like the Soviets, are good at the propaganda of success. You can feel the strains in the Russian economy. Keep it up, lean forward. And finally, I can't resist, as to Brian's point about Russia assuming responsibility, I don't like where Alexander Solzhenitsyn ended up, but in his wiser days, he once wrote that the line of good and evil runs through every nation and every human heart. I'm with Andreas Kubilius that Russia has democratic potential, but the road to that potential lies through Russia's defeat in Ukraine, and then we can see about whether Russia can account for its own miserable past. And I have to say that in the academic world, the rethinking of Russian history is taking place. In my world of American diplomacy, a lot of the champions of Ukraine have come from people who started out their careers as Russia specialists, who learned about Russia later through the prism of the people who Russia had visited. The Ukrainians, the Poles, the Balts. And that's been a hard road for us, and I think once learned will not be unlearned.
Thank you. And I'll recommend this article by Anders Östlund as well. He basically points out the disinformation that's going on about the success of Russia skirting the economic sanctions. He ends by saying the resilience of the Russian economy is largely illusory, and I recommend it to everyone. Let's squeeze in Brian and Daria. So Brian, history?
Yeah, first of all, I want to give a shout out to Georgi because the work you're doing at Sovlab is part of the solution here. Sovlab is publishing historical documents on Georgia's Soviet-era history that have been invaluable to me in my own work, and I think projects like this should be funded everywhere in the former Soviet space, in Belarus and elsewhere. To answer your question, there's good news and bad news. I mean, in universities where I am, the turnover is slow. There's only a few universities that are really teaching the history of these countries independent from the Russian colonial imperial version. Harvard University and Serhiy Plotky stand out, of course. Yale University and Timothy Snyder stand out, of course. Our Canadian neighbors to the north are much better than we Americans are at this, largely due to their large Ukrainian diaspora. But it's moving. I mean, I am trying to get Ukrainian studies instituted at the University of Texas, Arlington in the European Studies Department, not in the Russian Studies Department. But this is a tough fight. There's a lot of entrenched interests. University bureaucracies make the American government look, fast and nimble, right? So it's a slow fight. In the national security bureaucracy, and I learned this from a conversation I had with you, Dan, about the generational turnover that's going on among foreign service officers since 1991. And in the beginning, of course, everybody served in Moscow and everybody saw things through Moscow's lens. Now we have generations that have served in Riga and in Tallinn and in Kyiv and in Tbilisi, and they are starting to see the world a little bit differently. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, because I would gladly yield to you on that.
I need to go to Daria first,
right.
But thank you for that point, Brian. Daria.
I fully agree with Brian. We have to deoccupy history. But coming to Russians and good Russians and democratic future of Russia, I think that the West has to admit strategic failure for the last 35 years to believe that there can be democratic Russia and Russian liberals is the future of Russia. Unfortunately, people like Mikhail Zygar are absolute exemptions and absolute minority. And I believe that the only way when there will be accountability for Russia is when there will be in Kremlin the museum of all the genocidal war crimes which Russia and Russian people and Russian Soviet Union and before that Russian Empire committed against its neighbors, against Ukrainians, against Georgians, against Chechens, against Estonians, against Latvians, against Lithuanians, and we can count and count. I will believe that Russia has a future and Russian people has a future when Russian children will be studying in their historical textbooks about all these crimes. And I will feel relieved and I feel that my mission in this life will be accomplished when there will be actually the tribunal against Russians in Mariupol. Mm-hmm. And all the Russian citizens, those who will be left, they will be hearing about this tribunal, like it was with the Nazi Germany after their complete defeat. But I absolutely believe that defeat is the #1 task. And I want the last say thank you to all the Georgians, because we are here in Tbilisi, who are there in Ukraine now, in the armed forces, practically helping Russia to hold helping Ukraine to hold Russia accountable. This is the best way how to do that. And glory to Georgian heroes, which are with Ukrainian heroes, are doing that historic mission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And join me in thanking a fairly powerful panel with excellent messages. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Colleen, for a terrific moderation job. Panel, thank you very much for enduring the sun. We are going to take a 15-minute break and come back for the last panel for day 1. So be back here, please, at 3:50.